Thank you everyone for giving us the opportunity to be discussing our research into teacher wellbeing. I do apologise I can't be there in person, but fortunately Julianne Moss has been very kind to speak on my behalf. If you do have any other queries though that aren't met through this presentation, my email details are provided at the end of this presentation, so feel free to contact me. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that internationally it has been a growing issue, and we are at crisis levels with regards to teacher and educator shortages. There is rampant burnout that has been reported, there is high attrition issues, and job satisfaction is in decline with our teachers. With that said, this isn't a new issue. It has been reported for decades, above average stress, burnouts, depressive symptoms, and so on that our teachers are facing. There has, however, been a shift in this being more appreciated by governments, for example, after COVID-19, reflecting that they understand the importance of mental health. However, we still are emphasizing a reactive approach to mental health. So we're really looking at those ailments and trying to reduce them, compared to actually trying to build those skill sets from a proactive area where we, for example, building resilience of our teachers, which we argue is what is necessary and more effective in a world that is continuously changing. And I think COVID-19 really did highlight that our teachers and everyone in general can be really placed into unpredictable situations, and it's better to be able to have those skills to be able to weather challenging events and so on. So before we can do that, however, there is actually a lack of consensus of what well-being actually is, what should be considered or included within well-being frameworks, and that issue unfortunately has translated into teacher-specific well-being frameworks. Just there on the slide, I've listed just 6 recent either frameworks or indicators that have been published just within the last decade, and they all are different. They all provide different unique insights, but each of them are lacking components that others have. So the real challenge is, how do we actually amalgamate all the findings that are coming from these types of different frameworks and indicators that are being identified to be able to come to some sort of consensus? Because it's unrealistic for us to expect policymakers to be able to make effective well-being promotion strategies if we as researchers can't even come to the conclusion of what well-being actually is. So based off of my colleague and I's theory, the tripartite theory of well-being, we have argued that the current foundations of typical general well-being frameworks consist of a dichotomous definition, higher order factors of well-being, one either belonging to that hedonic well-being component and the other belonging to the eudaimonic well-being component. So we proposed a third well-being component that needs to be included there, and that's frenetic well-being, and that's associated with Plato's notion of phronesis. So frenetic well-being is the extent to which people have the capacity to make decision-making skills. It's practiced via wisdom, intelligence, and reason. Your capacity to be able to accomplish what you are intending to accomplish. So we can see here, these are the 3 different models that we want to test. So the first model is the argument that there's actually just one well-being higher order model. And if someone has got high well-being, they should reflect high levels of all these different well-being components, and each of those components are from the well-being pros. CT is clear thinking, self-acceptance, emotional stability, and so on. So you'll see the list a bit later on. The 2-factor model is what the majority of general well-being frameworks are based on, but that's the eudaimonic well-being and the hedonic well-being. And you can see there that clear thinking, self-acceptance, emotional stability, all those components are also tied within the eudaimonic well-being component. And the third model, the 3-factor model, is what represents our current conceptualization of well-being. And you can see there that clear thinking, self-acceptance, and emotional stability, we argue, are all traits that allow someone to be able to make better decisions and so on, and are distinctly different from eudaimonic well-being. And those 3 there are empathy, pro-social behavior, and positive relationships. So we tested this using 2 different samples, one from the US, a general population of 1,524, and another sample of 228 early childhood educators located in New Zealand for a workplace specific context. And as I said, we'll use the Wellbeing Pro traits to measure this, and we tested this via confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation modeling. Yeah, so just to go very briefly through these, the three-factor models, which is what represents our tripartite theory, they did represent the best goodness of fit with both samples, notably in the smaller sample from New Zealand, where it was the only well-being model that actually represented appropriate or acceptable fit. You want for these two, for example, to be at least 0.9. Anything under is typically considered as a poor fitting model, which means that what you have specified, the different factors should be, may not be accurate if it is below that. So the next step to assist with the systematic review is to ensure that we are able to use this overarching framework as a way to identify all current research that has been conducted on teacher and educator well-being. And by doing this, we took all the mentioned frameworks from before, broke it down there to see whether we could neatly place all the different components each of those frameworks were declaring as being core to educator well-being. And as you can see there, they did fit quite nicely as belonging to one or a few of the three traits. So we're like, great, okay, so we argue then that we can use our tripartite model as a good foundation and a guide to be able to not only identify the literature from these databases to conduct this systematic review, but also then to assist with the coding and draw conclusions. For the Prisma breakdown, from the database themselves, we identified 2,696 texts that were based off of the syntax that we used. And in addition, after we had gone to the full text screening, we also identified 990 additional texts to include based off of things that had cited these full texts and also the actual reference lists of those texts themselves. That then came to 2,112 after duplicates were removed, and that led to only 571 texts that we sought to retrieve and do the full text review, and only 25 we were unable to get the full text, which is actually not bad. And then we did the full text review on 546 texts in total, and 227 were excluded because they didn't meet some certain criteria that are just listed there. And so we got a final list of 319 texts to code. Now we have currently coded 67 texts, and we still have therefore 252 to code, but even just from those 67 texts, we have extracted 692 unique data points that we will be going through a snippet of those in a second to be able to draw conclusions. Okay, so of those 67 texts, 22 of those texts were associated with in-service teachers, whereas 45 were pre-service. You might be shocked to say, oh, only 13 were funded, but realistically, of those 67 texts, 47 had no information whatsoever about whether the study was funded or not. That is concerning. I'll talk about that a bit later. Country coverage, I wasn't surprised that the United States had the most, where 12 of the studies were located and conducted within the US, but second was Turkey, and I was quite unfamiliar with their emphasis and research within teacher well-being. You can see there, so that's, yeah, of interest. So, and of the total samples combined of all studies, there was a 67.78% of them were females. The average sample size across the different studies was 254 participants, and the average age was 28 years. Now, I'm going to stress here, we placed no restriction on years when articles were published, and this is quite an interesting insight into the actual how new and this field of research is compared to negative psychology. You can see there that the first paper that we identified wasn't until 2003, and you can see there weren't too many for the first few years after that until 2019, where they jumped up, and that's quite promising. It shows that there is a growing trend in looking at teacher wellbeing research. So we can see here that there is a study transparency and procedural score. So this was based off of what the Campbell collaboration, it's effectively the guidelines that social sciences use for conducting systematic reviews. It's based off of Cochrane, which is used the guidelines for medical research, those systematic reviews in there and meta-analyses. And what that stipulates is it's not saying whether or not their conclusions or what they're saying is effectively realistic or not, or it's actually just confirming whether or not these studies are reporting bare minimum for transparency purposes, and the methodological approaches that they have used are what is expected. For example, if the study was an intervention, one of the questions would be, were the two groups that they were comparing, the experimental group and the control group, were they the same effectively, no significant differences, except for whether or not they were involved in the intervention? Now, there is no definitive what minimum score you are required. It comes from a range of 0 to 1, but there are varied papers. It says that say that 0.7 is the minimum you want, or 0.8 is the minimum you want, to be able to say, okay, enough is reported here, it's transparent enough so we can actually rely on what is being stated here, and it makes sense, we know what they've done, and so on. And concerningly, of the 67 papers, 58% of them were deemed as having the minimally expected transparency and methodological practices that is typical of a quantitative study. Really bad. That is very concerning. So effectively, almost half of the papers, we could not determine whether the findings from them are reliable. That's not the breakdown. You can see there's the list also of the wellbeing pro factors that have been categorized into the tripartite model. And another very interesting insight is, and you can see in the pie chart there is an overwhelming emphasis on frenetic well-being, notably in self-esteem or self-efficacy. And also the second place is competence. So 71.1% of all well-being research on teacher education, based on the review so far we've done, has been associated with how competent and how well effectively teachers perform at their job. Now, the reason we can include self-esteem in here is because it is associated with how well they do their job, how well they believe they can manage a class, and so on. It's not about their life in general, but also it's just specific to their job. And then we look at hedonic well-being, like this is where you come to engagement and optimism and how positive they feel and the meaning they place behind their jobs. 10% of the studies that we looked at. And then the 18.8% remaining are associated with eudaimonic well-being, looking at what promotes those positive relationships, empathy in teachers, and also the pro-social based behavior in our teachers. The most impactful independent variables, so those things that influence some sort of well-being factor, and we're looking at holistic factors. You can see there the first one, the most impactful, is collaborative teacher assessment, and that is where you have teachers who effectively monitor or watch other teachers' practices, make comments, suggestions, criticisms, so on, and they work together to improve their practices, and that influenced 8 of the 16 different variables associated with well-being. Shortly, just under that was teacher training programs. Now, I do note that the training programs themselves varied significantly in nature. Some of them are very subject specific. It might be how well they teach a particular component within physics. It can be in general how well they teach to within a school that has a majority-minority student population. But what it does tell us is that there is a capacity to be able to develop a training program that can promote at least 8 different types of well-being components. So that may be a feasible method to develop holistic well-being in educators. And the third one, the extent of school leader support that teachers received. Fourth is tertiary and industry collaboration, so how closely universities, for example, would work with schools. And the fifth is a rather common one, and that's what we actually are starting to get into. Also, we know has a huge impact on those negative components, such as burnout and stress, is the extent of teaching teachers have versus the extent of administrative activities and responsibilities that they have. In summary, and to discuss very briefly, so the percentage of papers, as I pointed out before, that is such poor transparency or use very poor methodological approaches for quantitative analysis was just, it was so concerning. And that really identifies a big issue and gap in educational well-being research. Needs to work on their game associated with the quality of quantitative research. Another big issue, and it's the same issue that's reflected in the large number of different well-being frameworks and why we wanted to find a way to amalgamate everything, is that every study almost had a new measure to measure the same thing which is represented across those papers, but they're saying, oh no, but I need to develop a new measure for this and that and that, and then it comes that issue of jingle jangle fallacies. We see that all these different measures that are claiming to be the same thing are developed. The only exception to that, and that it provides an example, is we can do it, so we are using a same consistent psychometrically robust measure, is to do with self-efficacy, and that's the Bandura measure. It looks at 4 core teacher-specific components such as classroom management, and yeah, that is a concern as well because, as I said, it leads to issues of jingle jangle fallacies. It is promising that we are seeing a growth in interest and papers so far, yet there are still comparatively few quantitative papers, a way to try and quantify the impact and therefore come to some conclusions there. There was a very large overemphasis on frenetic well-being, notably self-efficacy and competence. And it really does reflect what education departments and so on are really emphasizing and value. Because if you consider the notions of competence and of self-efficacy, it is either how well or how well you perceive you conduct your job. It is how well you can therefore have students improve their competency and develop, which is definitely important, but it's not realistically teacher well-being. It's very much emphasized on the students. So we are really neglecting actually the true promotion of teacher well-being. And although not specifically related to teacher well-being, I am going to stress, declare, whenever you are publishing, declare if you received funding or not. It is a common thing I hear from educational researchers that they are neglected with regards to the extent of funding that they receive for research. If that is the case, you need to build that evidence. Why would you not then report that on your papers? 47 out of 67 papers just did not declare whether or not they received funding. Build that evidence. All right. Again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Feel free to email me up there, marcus.horde@deakin.edu.au, if you have any queries.